I'm going to jump right off of basically where Ryan just left off on State of Zarr and give you an update of where GeoZarr is. So using that same timeline that he just showed, I'm not going to go into specifics. You just heard everything to do with Zarr, but more specifically, how GeoZarr came to the picture was back in January 2022. Basically, a contractor for ESA was tasked with trying to make a cloud-native geodatabase for ESA data. They originally started working with COGS, realized that there was some deficiencies in that, and found Zarr and wanted to switch over to do Zarr. So the person that led that was someone named Christophe Noel. And he realized when he was trying to work with things like Xarray and working with Zarr that there was interoperability issues. And so there was a need for geospatial specification. He called this GeoZarr and essentially used CF conventions as a first sort of bat of getting a geospatial spec for Zarr. In the meantime, in OGC, which stands for Open Geospatial Consortium, right? So they're the entity that can approve geospatial standards. At the same time, Zarr v2 was adopted as a community standard. That means it's coming like from the community. It did not go through this typical bureaucratic process of a steering working group through OGC. The community basically comes already with something that the community uses and gets the OGC stamp of approval. So that happened for Zarr 2.0, but there is nothing geospatial to do with Zarr inherently. Fast forward to pretty much exactly a year ago this month, where I'm working at a data center at NASA. We are about to produce en masse a lot of Zarr data stores. And of course, the first question we have is what sort of metadata conventions do we need to abide by before we release this data to the public? I reached out to the Zarr community, Ryan, and asked, hey, what's the status of geospatial Zarr? And they pointed me to this existing GeoZarr effort from a repository that Christophe managed that hadn't been touched for basically 2 years. So we decided to sort of restart this effort, move Christophe's work to the main Zarr developers branch, and started very informal bi-weekly meetings with the hope of trying to also present a community standard for GeoZarr. So why do we need GeoZarr and why now? I don't think I have to really tell this room, but we have more and more people trying to use Zarr, but there's still a ton of open technical questions that we are trying to tackle, honestly, through sprints like these. And there's still a lot of work in order to ensure interoperability with common tools. So from like selfishly, my perspective as a data center, before we release Zarrs, we want to make sure that our end users can use them in the same way that they have in those legacy formats. So people are using ArcGIS or QGIS to open it. We want to make sure that works. But there's still a ton of work from using Zarrs to get that to happen. So with the bi-weekly meetings, we actually got a really awesome group of people who started volunteering time and joining these from a ton of different organizations. We had folks from USGS, DevSeed, Planet, Carbon Plan, a lot of folks in the room. And even more interesting, we actually saw sort of people coming together from 2 different communities, right? We had people coming from GeoTIFF world and then sort of NetCDF world. And we thought, oh, cool, a sort of meeting ground for these 2 communities to talk. But I think what we really realized is that it was more of like a battleground, and we started getting really in the weeds off of what people were probably seeing in limitations from CF conventions not meeting the needs of, let's say, the GeoTIFF type community. And so there was a lot of really interesting, very philosophical questions that started coming up in our bi-weekly meetings. For example, understanding that NetCDF itself is more than just a data format, right? It is a data model. And so how Zarr is going to sit relative to the CF data model is like a decision that the GeoZarr working group would have to make. But we started getting caught up again with these maybe limitations of the lack of needs from a GeoTIFF community in the CF conventions. So for example, how to encode CRS information. This is like an open, let's say, conversation from GeoTIFF world that, wow, we were just getting backlogged. And I think we lost a little bit of momentum here because instead of actually implementing a specification, we were just sitting talking about kind of theory of like, how do we hold CRS information the best way, if we even should, within a GeoZarr spec. And so we made the decision to move from our attempt of being a community model to the OGC Standards Working Group, or SWIG. There, I think we lost, honestly, a little bit of momentum, simply because people don't want the bureaucratic way of actually moving forward, right? Like this oversight. Also, OGC is pay to play, right? So you have to be an OGC member to actually vote and make approvals for these sort of specifications. But we really lacked, a mechanism of governance and making decisions within GeoZarr. So we were just a group of 10 volunteers not agreeing on things like CRS, and none of us really having the authority of saying who's right or wrong. And so we decided to go through with becoming a SWIG. Myself and Christoph wrote a charter with contributions from that community and submitted it as a SWIG, which was approved back in November of 2023. It is now we're now waiting for it to become a subgroup where then we can actually elect chairs. Tentatively, Christoph and I are co-chairing this. But we've decided to kind of still maintain this open source way of working, and that we're still hosting our meetings, through Google, documenting things through HackMD. We're not doing it the typical, like relying on OGC to schedule meetings for us or anything like that. We're still pretty adamant that we can develop in the open, and once we're ready as a community with some geospatial spec, we can then bring it into the SWIG, do votes and things like this. I put here on just, people's reservations, again, around going through OGC. And what we don't want to happen, right, is to just produce hundreds of pages of documentation without actually something that works. And so I put this example of like OGC tiles where people were basically commenting that the spec itself is useless to like an end user, right? Like no one is going to go in and read the documentation. People are just going to try to test an implementation. So we're looking to things like Stack or GeoParquet as sort of being success stories in terms of like how to implement a specification and not relying on just focusing on the documentation, which, to be honest, that's where we were roadblocked. We were in this just really theoretical conversations, and we really lacked an implementer or a champion in the community of somebody actually going in and like just do a spec and see what breaks. We don't really have that person, I would say, in the GeoZarr world. And that's why I'm really excited to have a sprint like this for us to be able to like make a big step forward. So that way we can just see, does this open in QGIS? Yes or no? If no, what needs to happen to be able to get that functionality? Okay. Just high level, the objectives, right, is to ensure compatibility, data discovery, also being able to mix data. We've also learned like some OGC terminology of like trying to figure out what would be conformance classes. So there's going to be some requirement in the specification, but then what are sort of these optional add-ons, right? And we're hoping that these conformance classes are a way that we can also meet the needs of GeoTIFF community that wants to host Zarr data. And an example of this is like the need for multi-scaling or pyramiding. That's probably, we don't want to require that, right, for all geospatial Zarr stores. But for people who want to leverage multi-scaling, that would become then an optional conformance class. There's also lots of similar and existing work that we can build on. So looking at the work from the Geodata Cube, OGC SWIG, also XCube, which is X-ray based Geodata Cube. There is already a GDAL, let's say, functionality like with Zarr. There's NetCDF Zarr. There's also new work with GeoX-Array. So we're not starting at nothing with this initiative. The last thing to maybe relate it back to what Ryan presented is that we sort of sit downstream from Zarr itself, right? And so one of these Zarr enhancement proposals is also formalizing the concept of these conventions. GeoZarr would be a convention that would then fit under a Zarr convention itself. But things like pyramiding or multi-scaling, because Zarr is such a new data format, there still does not exist a ZEP for pyramiding. And that is a need that's beyond geospatial world, right? And so we're looking to also help efforts like what Max has done, Carbon Plan has done for doing multi-scaling, and fitting that into a Zarr enhancement proposal that would then be taken up by GeoZarr. So like in the charter, how we've written it is that GeoZarr sits downstream of Zarr. And so some of the work that we might do today is actually going to be fitting into Zarr, but then GeoZarr would inherently adopt that. but just like adding in that there are still so many open issues that are not geospatial specific, right? So just there needs to be a standard for pyramiding in Zarr. And then on top of that, once it comes to GeoZarr, what sort of metadata to get that to work with common tools needs to happen. And yeah, I think Ryan also touched on this, right? That Zarr is actually maybe more akin to Stack in terms of like being able to actually search for the data. But I think that's really it.